My name is Natalie James. I was 23 the night my father laughed in my face over dinner and told me I wouldn't last 3 days in basic training. Join the Navy. My father's voice broke into a deep, amused laugh that echoed off the wood-paneled walls like a punchline everyone had been waiting for. Basic will grind you up, sweetheart. 3 days in, you'll be crying for your mama. His bourbon glass clinked against the edge of his plate as he took a slow sip as if to let the moment marinate. The room joined him, my older brother with his predictable eye roll, my younger cousin, who tried to smother his smirk with a napkin, and my mother who stared straight into her green beans like they held a portal to another life. No one asked why. No one asked what drew me to it or what I was hoping to find. They didn't doubt my decision because it was risky. They doubted it because I was me. We were in the dining room of our house in Williamsburg, Virginia, where the silverware always matched where prayer came before meals, and where men's opinions filled more space than the furniture. My father, retired Marine Corps Master Sergeant Vietnam vet collector of rifles and grudges, ran our household the way he ran his unit direct orders, quiet women and boys raised to the bar. I'd grown up in that current learning curve to spin in silence. My job at the table was to pass the salt, say please, and thank you, and never ever make things uncomfortable. That night I didn't make a speech. I didn't read the list of reasons I'd written in the back of my journal about duty purpose, about how I needed to do something that wasn't safe and expected. I didn't mention the late nights I spent running on cold asphalt, in worn-out sneakers practicing push-ups in the basement, while the house slept. I didn't say a word when my brother Luke leaned back in his chair and chuckled, "Hope they don't make you carry a pack. That thing's half your size." Or when my dad followed up with, "She'll be back before they get her name stitched on a uniform." What I remember most vividly is the way my grandmother looked at me. She didn't say anything either, not out loud, but her eyes locked with mine across the table. She was in her 80s, her frame small and curved from years of standing on worn bones, but there was something in her gaze that held firm. She'd served as a Navy nurse in Korea, back when women in uniform were seen more as decoration than as equals. She knew something about being doubted before you even opened your mouth. She didn't smile, but she gave me the nod. The kind that says, "I see you. Go anyway." My mother's silence was more complicated. She'd grown up a military wife's daughter, then became one herself. She knew what that life meant. Maybe part of her was afraid for me. Maybe part of her was jealous I had the nerve to go. Either way, she didn't speak. She just kept cutting her chicken breast into small, identical pieces until it looked more like duty than dinner. When dessert was served, I declined. I stood, gathered my plate, and took it to the sink. My father didn't stop me. He leaned back, unbothered, asking Luke about the regional sales meeting and whether the company truck had new tires yet. I walked past the cabinet filled with family portraits, Luke in his cap and gown, my cousin with his fiancée, my father with his medals, and stepped outside into the night without saying goodbye. The air was heavy with Virginia humidity, that sticky July kind that clings to your skin like wet cloth. I sat in my car, hands on the steering wheel, breathing through the ache in my chest, like I'd trained myself to do. The tears came but slowly, like they were trying not to be noticed. I didn't cry because they didn't believe in me. I'd known that part for years. I cried because part of me had still hoped some small, stupid part that they might look up and see me for real. That they might ask why now, or why the Navy, and not why you. That night I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, replaying the dinner like a mission gone wrong. But something shifted in me. I didn't feel rage. I felt a kind of stillness I'd never felt before. I knew now that I couldn't bring any of their voices with me. Not my father's taunts, not Luke's laughter, not even my mother's silences. If I was going to survive basic training, I'd have to shed the version of me they had written and write myself from scratch. By morning I had packed. I left a note on the counter. "Don't wait up. I'll be gone before you finish your coffee." And then I drove not just away from the house, but away from the role I'd been handed since birth. The good daughter was gone, and in her place, quietly, stubbornly, was someone my father didn't see coming. I grew up in a house where being easy was mistaken for being content. I wasn't the loud one. I wasn't the rebellious one. I wasn't the golden boy with trophies in his closet, and Dad's name stitched into every compliment he received. I was the quiet one, the helper, the one who didn't make a mess, didn't raise her voice, didn't ask for more. I colored inside the lines because I thought that's where love lived. But there's a difference between being loved and being tolerated. I didn't figure that out until much later. When I was a kid, I thought being invisible was just part of growing up female in a house where men took up all the air. My father liked his daughters soft-spoken and his sons strong. I learned early that praise was not mine to earn, only to witness. When Luke got into college, Dad threw a backyard barbecue. When I made honor roll for the 5th straight semester, he blinked, nodded once, and turned the TV back up. I didn't resent my brother. He played the game he was taught. But I did start to understand that if I wanted a life that felt mine, I'd have to leave the rules of that house behind. I wasn't planning to rebel. I was planning to disappear and return on my own terms. The first thing I did was start running. At night, with no audience, no playlist, just the sound of my feet hitting cracked sidewalks in rhythm with a pulse I hadn't trusted in years. I started with 1 mile and nearly threw up in the bushes behind the Baptist church on the corner. But I came back the next night, and the one after that. Soon, I could run 5 miles without stopping, without hating myself for trying. Then came push-ups. I couldn't do a full one at first. I started with planks, wall presses, anything I could do in my room without drawing attention. I researched military fitness tests online, made a list, taped it to the back of my closet door. I also started reading not just history, but strategy intelligence work, decision-making under pressure, books about military leadership, human behavior and combat negotiation tactics. Titles Dad would have called boy books. Titles that made the librarian raise an eyebrow when I checked them out. I read them cover to cover, took notes, ran mental drills in my head when I couldn't sleep. I wasn't trying to be impressive. I was trying to be prepared. When I told my guidance counselor during senior year that I wanted to join the Navy instead of applying to college right away, she paused for a second too long before replying, "Have you considered community college first? Or maybe something in early education?" She smiled like she was offering me a soft landing, but it felt more like a padded ceiling. I didn't argue. I just nodded and took the recruitment pamphlet from the shelf myself. I filled out the paperwork in secret, printed and signed it during lunch in the computer lab. I used my own savings to cover the application fees and testing appointments. The nearest recruiter was 2 towns over, so I lied and told my parents I was volunteering at the food bank. I took the ASVAB passed with high scores and started prepping for the physical qualification test. Before I left for basic, I cut my own hair in the bathroom mirror. Not out of vanity, quite the opposite. I didn't want to give anyone a reason to call me pretty. I didn't want to be noticed for the wrong things. I'd read enough online forums to know how women in uniform were often treated, especially in their first year. I didn't want to be called sweetheart by a drill sergeant or asked to smile in a room full of barking orders. I wanted to be a shadow, a machine, a blank canvas. If they were going to judge me, I wanted it to be for my grit, not my face. I didn't pack photos. I didn't bring letters. I carried one thing, a folded note I'd written to myself that read, "Don't give them a reason to say he was right." He, of course, being my father, who had once told me that some people are built for war and some people are built to watch it on TV. I wasn't interested in proving him wrong just for the sake of spite. I was interested in redefining what built for war looked like. My goal wasn't just survival. It wasn't just finishing basic or making it through intel school. It was proving to myself more than anyone that worth is not handed down from fathers or signed into law by teachers or stamped onto transcripts. I wanted to earn my own damn definition. I wanted a life with weight, one that didn't require someone else's last name or approval to exist. No one bet on me, not my teachers, not my classmates, not my family. And maybe that was the point. Maybe it was the absence of belief that carved the space for me to build my own. Not loud, not flashy, just brick by quiet brick, far away from the applause I never got and no longer needed. The first day of basic training stripped me faster than I expected, not of clothes, but of certainty. At 5'4" and barely 110 pounds, I stood in a freezing intake hall, surrounded by men who looked like they'd been born on pull-up bars. The concrete under our boots felt like it was meant to remind us that comfort was no longer part of the package. The air smelled of bleach sweat and fear. We weren't recruits yet. We were meat waiting to be molded or discarded. The first insult came 10 minutes in. Barbie, a guy muttered behind me when I fumbled my duffel bag. Another added, "Hope she brought glitter for inspection." I didn't flinch. I'd trained for that. I knew the names would come before the respect and the laughter, before the silence. But nothing quite prepares you for the way the cold bites through every layer, how your own sweat turns into ice between drills, how your lungs start to feel like gravel-filled sacks by hour 3. The yelling wasn't personal, not yet. It was just noise barked from every direction like the world had turned into a megaphone. Faster, get your knees up, you call that a push-up. I did what I could. I kept moving, kept my eyes forward, kept my jaw locked. But by dinner that first night, my hands were raw, my legs were trembling, and my bunkmate, a blonde girl from Ohio who'd spent summers with a personal trainer, was crying silently into her pillow. I didn't cry, not because I was stronger, just because I'd spent years learning how not to. Tears were for bedrooms with closed doors. Here in this brutal ballet of commands and consequences, they were currency I couldn't afford to spend. The next week turned my body into a science experiment in endurance. Every part of me screamed. The blisters on my heels bled through my socks. My forearms throbbed from carrying rifles that felt twice my size. Every muscle I thought I had trained before I arrived here, every carefully conditioned inch betrayed me. The drill instructors had radar for weakness, and mine blinked like a neon sign. One called me featherweight. Another asked if I'd wandered in from the secretary pool. But the worst wasn't what they said. It was the way no one expected me to last. There was an unspoken countdown even from some of the other women. It wasn't hostility, it was statistics. The ones like me, small, quiet, not from military families, usually didn't make it past week 3. Still, I didn't quit. I learned to eat faster than I could think, shower in 90 seconds, and sleep like the dead for exactly 4 hours a night. I learned how to strip and reassemble a weapon in the dark, how to march without letting my head bob, how to carry someone bigger than me without my knees buckling. I threw up on day 5 mid-sprint and kept running. I fell face first into mud during night drills and got up before anyone could laugh. I lost weight. I gained bruises, but I started to see it, that flicker in their eyes when I finished strong. I wasn't fast. I wasn't loud, but I was still there. And in basics, sometimes showing up again and again is the most dangerous thing you can do. There was a moment somewhere in week 4 when something shifted. We were doing endurance climbs, the kind that leave even the bulky guys gasping. One of them fell. Another tapped out. I kept going. Not because I had more strength, but because I had decided pain was temporary, but giving up would last forever. After the climb, I sat on a crate with my arms limp at my sides and sweat dripping from my hairline. That's when Staff Sergeant Daniels walked by, paused, and said something I would remember for the rest of my career. "You're not the fastest, you're not the strongest, but you don't break. I'll take 10 of you over one loudmouth with abs." It wasn't praise, not really, but it was the first sign that I'd been seen. After that, the taunts slowed. I started getting nods instead of jokes. One guy who'd called me Barbie early on asked if I could check his form during PT. Another let me cut in line at the mess hall without saying a word. There were still moments when my legs gave out or my breath stuttered in my throat. But I'd stopped measuring progress in perfection. The win was surviving the day without losing myself. Basic doesn't just push your body. It sandblasts your identity. It's not about who you are when you walk in. It's about who you decide to be when everything is stripped away. Every sleepless night, every rolled ankle, every scream in your ear is asking the same question. What are you made of when no one's watching? For me, the answer was quiet steel. Not visible, not celebrated, but real. By the time week 6 arrived, No one questioned if I'd finish. Even the instructors started speaking to me differently, not with softness, but with expectation. I wasn't a joke anymore. I was a variable in the equation. I'd gone from background noise to something they factored in. I wasn't proud yet, not fully, but I was certain of one thing: this was just the beginning. And when I stood at attention under that boiling sun, my back straight and my eyes sharp, I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone anymore. Not even to my father, not even to myself. I was simply becoming who I had always been, without apology and without permission. Getting into intelligence pre-training was never part of my original plan. I had assumed, perhaps naively, that the hard work ended after basic. That once I proved I could outrun my doubts, outlast the bruises, and finish strong, I'd finally feel like I belonged. But in the military, belonging is a mirage. The closer you get, the more it shifts. Pre-intel was invitation only, and I got the nod quietly without ceremony 2 days after graduation. "You've been flagged for Tier B placement," they told me. "Report to Norfolk, 0600 Monday." No explanation. Just a room number and a new uniform code. When I arrived, I immediately understood why no one talked about it. The first thing I noticed was the ratio. Out of 32 candidates, 3 were women. The rest were men, older, sharper, with chins like razors, and voices that didn't ask questions. I was younger than most of them by at least 5 years. The room smelled like dry coffee and institutional doubt. Most of them already knew each other. Their fathers had served together. Their uncles were contractors. Their cousins were already embedded in overseas intel posts. They spoke in acronyms I hadn't learned yet. I kept quiet and listened. That's when I met Turner. Lieutenant Michael Turner was everything. I was not tall, confident, smooth with his words, and sharper with his tone. He had the posture of someone who believed the room existed for him. He'd served 2 years abroad, rumor had it, in some black file unit that didn't officially exist. People listened when he spoke. They laughed at his jokes, even when they weren't funny. He clocked me on day 1, and not in the friendly way. I don't know what it was. Maybe the lack of pedigree, maybe the silence, maybe the fact that I didn't laugh when he said, "We'll see how long the girls last this time." I wasn't here to make friends, and certainly not to impress him. The days in intel school were long and designed to make you feel like a fraud. Every hour came with a new simulation, a new scenario, a new failure you couldn't afford. Misinformation drills, threat assessments, pattern tracking. It wasn't just about smarts. It was about speed, instinct, nerve. I did well in the early weeks. Not flashy, but consistent. Enough to get a few nods. Enough to be ignored, which in this place was as good as praise. Then came the trial op. We were divided into small teams and given a simulated intercept, a fabricated intelligence leak hidden inside a digital transmission buried in the noise of satellite chatter. It was meant to replicate a real-world cyber threat. The goal was to extract the target intel, identify the source, and recommend a course of action, all in under 2 hours. I was teamed with Turner. Of course I was. From the beginning, it was clear he expected to lead. Fine. I followed orders. I ran the decrypts, flagged anomalies, documented time codes. But something didn't add up. The data stream was behaving oddly, like it had been planted, like the entire drill had a second layer no one had mentioned. I tried to bring it up. Turner brushed me off. "Stick to your lane," he snapped. "This isn't a term paper. We submitted our report with 15 minutes to spare." 2 hours later, the instructors called us in. "Critical failure," one of them said. "The source was a honeypot. You recommended a real-world strike against a decoy system in the field that would have triggered open conflict." Turner didn't flinch. He pointed to my name on the log. She ran the decrypts. She was lead on signal verification. That call came from her. It was fast, cold, surgical. For a second, I couldn't speak. Not because I was afraid, but because I realized just how easy it was to be erased. They pulled me from the next 2 drills, placed me under review. But what Turner didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that I'd kept a private copy of the session. Every command, every log entry, every internal note I'd typed and flagged, not to protect myself, just because I had learned by now to keep records when no one was watching. I didn't say anything. I didn't argue. I waited. I reviewed every line of the data that night in the barracks, headphones and heart steady. I wrote my shadow report. Not for the instructors, for myself. Because I knew this wasn't over. I wasn't going to be the girl who got knocked out quietly. Not here, not now. Let Turner win the round. I was already planning the long game. They didn't cut me. That was the first surprise. After the failed simulation with Turner after being publicly blamed and quietly sidelined, I expected the worst. That's how it usually works: one misstep in intelligence training, and you're reassigned to a desk job so far from action, it may as well be exile. But I stayed. No apology, no reinstatement speech. Just a new folder on my desk the following week marked Pacific Signals Interruption, Urgent. The briefing was classified, but the whisper around the room was that a cyber attack had disrupted a radar feed off the Guam coast. They were calling it a glitch, but no one believed that. In intelligence, the line between malfunction and threat is razor thin and always political. They didn't assign me to a team. They didn't ask for an analysis. It was framed like a courtesy. Take a look at this, James, while we wait for the big dogs to confirm. I understood the tone. I was being benched, but someone was curious enough to let me play with the scraps. I didn't argue. I took the file back to my terminal and read every line of code until my eyes blurred and my back ached. And somewhere around hour 7 I saw it. The error wasn't in the primary stream. That's why they'd missed it. It was buried in a secondary timestamp loop, 2 microseconds off a sequence that didn't match any recorded protocol signature. To anyone else, it would look like a hardware hiccup, but I knew patterns. I'd spent the last 2 years training my brain to listen to digital rhythms the way others read body language. And this one pulsed wrong. So I followed it, backtracked it through the waveform, isolated its origin, and found a ghost signal pinging from just outside a known naval corridor. Whoever had sent it had masked it beautifully, but not perfectly. The data packet was too small to hold a damage payload, but just large enough to trigger a reroute in satellite radar, exactly the kind of reroute that would allow a submarine, for instance, to slip through undetected. I compiled my findings, quietly. I didn't bring it up in the briefing room, didn't send it to the whole chain. I emailed it directly to the commanding intelligence officer on the case, along with a line that simply read, "Recommend immediate review of subchannel data logs. Possible redirection protocol observed." Then I went back to my quarters and tried to sleep. 2 days later, the base commander asked to see me. He didn't sit behind his desk. He stood arms crossed, face unreadable. "How the hell did you see that?" he asked. I gave the most honest answer I could. It didn't feel right. Turns out my instinct, my hunch, my pattern obsession had flagged what a dozen others with better security clearance had missed. It wasn't just a test signal. It was a probe. A small, calculated intrusion, likely from a foreign entity testing blind spots. Harmless this time. But next time it might not be. The report went up the chain of command quickly. By the end of the week, I was flown to D.C. under what they called a discretionary consult. No uniform, no nameplate. Just a suit 2 sizes too stiff, and a Pentagon visitor badge that felt too temporary for the weight it carried. The meeting was short: 2 generals, 1 civilian director, a sealed file on the table with my name on it. "We've been watching," one of them said. "We'd like to bring you into Division 9. I didn't ask what Division 9 was. People who ask questions in rooms like that don't get invited back. But I knew the rumors: an elite shadow unit handling counterintelligence with black file clearance and operational freedom. No press, no medals, no mistakes. The kind of place where careers either ignite or vanish. I said yes. Of course I did. I flew back to base, packed in silence, and received new orders marked "No external disclosure." I didn't call home. I didn't send a letter. By that point, my family didn't even know I was still in the Navy. My mother had texted me once 3 months earlier to ask if I'd be home for Christmas. I never responded. My father hadn't mentioned my name since the night I left. Luke, my brother, had gotten married. I wasn't invited. So when I stepped into the black SUV waiting outside the gate at 0400 duffel in hand and badge clipped to a blank uniform, I wasn't leaving anything behind. Not really. That night, in a small government facility tucked behind a false contractor name, I stared at my new workstation. No windows, no personal items, allowed, no identifiers, just a terminal and a chair. It should have felt cold. Instead, it felt honest. For the first time, I wasn't proving anything to anyone. Not fighting for recognition, not dodging politics. I had simply seen something no one else had, and that had been enough. In a world obsessed with noise, I had survived by listening, and that made me dangerous in all the right ways. Division 9 didn't exist on paper. There were no plaques on walls, no recruitment flyers, no organizational chart with our names in neat boxes. We weren't a unit, we were a shadow. Formally, it was referred to as a Special Intelligence Contingency Group. Informally, it was where the Navy sent the ones they couldn't risk putting on official record. We handled what no one else wanted to claim: cross-border intel disputes, rogue data leaks, sabotage missions, too delicate for black ops, too dangerous for diplomacy. Our job was simple: keep the balance before the world noticed it had shifted. The facility was underground, buried beneath a federal contractor building in D.C. that technically sold cloud security software. You needed 3 badges just to get into the hallway that led to the real entrance. The elevator didn't have buttons. It responded only to biometric tags, each one coded to deny or grant access to layers of classified command. The walls were gray, the air was cold, the lights were the kind that didn't hum. There were no windows, no clocks, no Wi-Fi. The only signal that mattered was encrypted internal and constantly monitored. Time moved differently here, not forward or back, just sideways, looping endlessly through data feeds and encrypted noise. I was the only woman in the room. At first, no one said it out loud. They didn't need to. It showed in the pauses before my name was spoken, the way the air shifted when I entered the secure ops center. I wasn't harassed. I wasn't insulted. But I wasn't trusted either. Not yet. I knew the rules: earn your space without demanding it, prove your edge, without showing your emotion, and above all, make no mistakes. Men in this line of work could recover from failure. I could not. I kept my voice low, my reports flawless, and my assumptions documented. I knew how to thread my presence between suspicion and necessity. The work was relentless, analyzing foreign military movements in real time, tracking psychological ops campaigns on hostile forums, decoding chatter that often meant the difference between peace and war. We sat at the edge of global chaos, and most of the time, our reward was that no one heard about it. That was when I saw Turner again. I spotted him in the Situation Room 3 days into my new post, seated 2 terminals down, wearing the same tight grin he had used back in pre-intel training. He didn't flinch when he saw me, just raised his coffee cup slightly as if to say, "What a small world." It wasn't an accident that he was here. Division 9 only took operatives with clearance, intuition, and connections. Turner had all 3. What he didn't have, though, was patience for competition, especially from me. He started subtle. Minor data discrepancies in my reports, corrections that didn't exist in the original logs. An urgent file that mysteriously vanished from my terminal hours before a team debrief. A simulated breach he swore I missed even though I'd flagged it the night before. I double-checked everything. I started backing up my files in off-grid encryptions, writing code that left digital fingerprints only I could trace. I wasn't paranoid. I was practiced. Turner was smart, but he underestimated my capacity to wait. When that didn't shake me, he moved to psychological plays. During a late-night rotation, he made a casual remark about a conversation I'd never had. The next day, another officer asked if I'd requested a reassignment. I hadn't. These were the kind of games that didn't leave bruises, just doubt. In a place where no one admitted weakness, even a whisper could become a verdict. But I'd been underestimated too long to be caught off guard now. I began collecting proof, quietly, like a forensic artist sketching in the dark. Every manipulated timestamp, every erased line of code, every discrepancy between what I entered and what appeared. I tracked patterns. Language syntax, the digital version of fingerprints. Turner was good, but arrogance makes people sloppy. He left traces, and I followed. I didn't confront him. That would have made it personal. I made it procedural. When our team lead questioned a major report discrepancy, one that could have impacted an overseas drone strike authorization, I offered to walk them through the backup logs. I brought a printout. I let the data speak. Line by line, it showed that my report had been altered after submission rerouted through a shadow protocol only accessible by 3 people, one of whom was Turner. He wasn't fired. Not immediately. They don't fire people in places like Division 9. They reassign. They fade. 2 weeks later, his name disappeared from the roster. The chair next to mine sat empty. No one asked questions. That's not how this place works. But from that moment on, things shifted. The briefings got shorter when I spoke. My analysis was sent higher without edits. I started getting solo assignments not for grunt work, but for risk scenarios. I became quietly the person they called when they needed answers with no margin for error. I didn't gloat. I didn't change how I spoke or dressed or moved. I simply stayed steady, like a storm wall they didn't know they'd needed until it was already holding the line. I didn't win because I outshouted Turner. I won because I outlasted him, and because I knew how to turn silence into leverage. Division 9 doesn't offer praise. No commendation ceremonies. No mission pins. But in our world, trust is the currency. And now, mine carried weight. It didn't start as a crisis. It started as a discrepancy. 3 lines of metadata on a routing log, barely enough to raise an eyebrow in most offices, but just wrong enough to raise my pulse. I was reviewing encrypted intercepts tied to satellite feeds over the South China Sea. Routine work. Monitoring for signs of data tampering, false flag communication, or unusual heat signatures. The logs were clean on the surface, but something about the timing of a signal jump didn't fit. 2 milliseconds too early. A fragment of a ping that wasn't accounted for in any known pattern. Most analysts would have flagged it as noise and moved on. But I'd seen this before, once in a simulation, once in a drill gone wrong. This wasn't noise. It was orchestration. I spent the next 4 hours digging. The packet trail was designed to disappear. But I'd learned to look where others didn't, beneath the cross-hatched pings and time delay cloaks buried inside a disguised latency code that made it appear harmless. Once unraveled, it pointed to something we weren't prepared for: a blind corridor opening in U.S. naval radar coverage just southeast of the Spratly Islands. A gap timed precisely to the position of a U.S. submarine running silent and another vessel unmarked approaching on a mirrored trajectory. I didn't need confirmation. I knew what it was. I ran the alert protocol. No names, no command titles, just code. The message was sent to a classified response channel, marked with my clearance, and an advisory timestamp: intervention required. Possible spoofed contact path intersecting Allied subcourse. Confirm ID reroute immediately. They rerouted within 9 minutes. Later, I'd learned that the second vessel was a Chinese attack-class submarine responding to falsified proximity data that had been rerouted to show a U.S. breach. The near collision was avoided by less than 500 meters. If the trajectory hadn't shifted in time, the outcome would have been international headlines or worse. I didn't say a word to anyone. Not that day, not the next. The thing about Division 9 is that victories aren't always shared. We worked in dark rooms and whispered codes where silence was safer than applause. I submitted a classified report anonymously through a clearance chain reserved for high-risk internal audits. I never signed my name. I didn't need to. But the system knew. Within a week, my section chief was removed. No explanation, no reassignment. Just gone. Replaced quietly, like a piece on a chessboard, no longer protecting the king. I received no thank you, no inquiry, no debrief. And then one morning, I opened my encrypted inbox and saw it. A single email. No subject line. No salutation. Just a file attached: new credentials, new badge scan, and a new rank. Effective immediately, Commander Naval Intelligence Division 9. That was it. No ceremony. No commendation. No folded flag or polished insignia. Just 5 words that meant everything. Commander. I stared at the screen for almost 5 full minutes before I exhaled. Not from relief, not even from pride. Just the strange, quiet recognition that I had arrived. Not where others thought I should be. Not where my father imagined I would crash and burn. But here at the center of a machine most people would never even know existed. A machine I had learned to navigate in silence, built on instinct, patience, and the willingness to see what others overlook. There was no one to call, no one to tell. My family hadn't asked where I was in over a year. They probably assumed I worked in logistics or admin, maybe something safe and vaguely respectable. My brother still posted gym selfies and vacation photos. My mother had stopped texting. My father, well, he hadn't used my name since the day I left. But I wasn't thinking about them. I was thinking about the girl who had cut her hair before basic so no one would call her pretty. The girl who threw up mid-sprint but kept running. The girl who stayed quiet in the room until the room turned toward her. And the woman who now held a position with no roadmap, no mentor, and no margin for mistakes, only instinct and precision and the trust of people who'd never once said her name out loud, but had just given her the keys to the quietest war on earth. I closed the email. I didn't save it. I didn't print it. I didn't need to. Because I knew who I was now. Not someone chasing recognition, not someone waiting for permission to be powerful. I was the answer to a question no one else had asked, and the one they called when the margins got too thin for error. 6 years later, the kitchen hadn't changed. The same floral curtains hung limp over the fogged windows. The same clock ticked unevenly above the stove, still 3 minutes slow like it had always been. The table was set with the same chipped white plates and polished silverware, positioned with surgical precision by my mother's familiar hands. Everything looked the same, everything but me. And maybe the chair I was sitting in, because this time I sat at the head of the table. My father barely glanced up when I entered. He was older now, grayer, slower to stand, though he still carried himself like a man who thought he could outrun age. My mother looked thinner, her eyes dimmed by years I hadn't been around to witness. Luke wasn't there. I didn't ask why. This dinner wasn't about him. It had been years since I'd come home. Real home, not the surface-level holiday stop-ins or the phone calls that danced around weather and, "Are you eating enough?" without ever touching anything real. I'd been invited back for my mother's birthday. I accepted not because I missed the house, but because something inside me wanted to see if the silence still had the same grip, whether the room still belonged to him or whether I could reclaim it, not with noise, but with presence. Dinner started the same way it always had. Grace was said. My mother brought out roasted chicken and green beans, and my father poured himself a neat bourbon without asking if anyone else wanted a drink. We talked about the neighborhood, how the Walkers had finally sold their house, how the church replaced the youth pastor with someone less dramatic. My father asked if traffic had been bad coming in. I said no. My mother asked if I'd been sleeping well. I said yes. Then came the question. So my father said, carving into his chicken with too much force, "What are you doing these days? Still in admin? Or did you switch departments again?" It wasn't mean. It was worse, casual, dismissive, like someone asking the mailman how long his route was. As if I had spent the last 6 years sorting spreadsheets or scheduling meetings at a base somewhere behind a desk with no risk and no consequence. He didn't mean it to hurt. That's what made it sting. I looked at him for a moment, then reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my phone and placed it face down on the table in front of me. "I was appointed last week," I said, my voice level calm as if reading a weather update. "Commander, Naval Intelligence, Division 9. The silence that followed stretched out like wire. 8 seconds. I counted them not on purpose, but the way you count when your breath is caught between your ribs and you're not sure how it's going to land. My mother's fork froze midair. My father didn't blink, but his jaw shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. The room didn't gasp. No one shouted. It just held still, like the moment wasn't sure what to do with itself. Finally, he spoke. So he said slowly, setting his fork down beside the plate, "You actually did it." I didn't smile. I didn't lean forward. I didn't offer softness. "No," I said quietly. "I've been doing it for a long time. You just didn't want to see it." That part landed. His eyes flickered just briefly. My mother looked down, adjusting her napkin, though it didn't need adjusting. No one spoke after that. We finished the meal in silence. Not awkward, not tense, just changed. The kind of silence that finally has shape. After dinner, I helped my mother with the dishes. She didn't ask me anything more about my title, or what I did, or what it meant to be a commander. She just touched my wrist lightly as I handed her a dish towel and said, "I always knew." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I left before dessert. There was no need for a long goodbye. My father stayed in his chair watching a muted game on the living room TV. He didn't stand. But as I opened the door, he said one word low, almost too soft to catch. "Natalie." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an apology. But it was the first time he'd said my name since the day I left. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. Because I had already taken back the table. Not with revenge, not with rage, but with the quiet gravity of someone who no longer needed to be seen to know her worth. I stayed in Division 9. Not because I had nowhere else to go, but because it was the only place where silence was sacred, where what mattered most happened far beyond what anyone would ever see or celebrate. The mission changed over time. The work shifted. My clearance expanded. I no longer ran point on active operations, but I stayed close enough to the front lines to know what was at stake. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to lead not just in title, but in presence. My focus turned toward training. Not the kind with handbooks or lectures, but the kind where you teach someone how to trust their own instinct when the data says one thing and their gut says another. I started working with younger officers, many of them just like I had been. Overlooked, uninvited, quiet, steady, underestimated. I didn't tell them my story. Not directly. I didn't need to. They could see it in how I listened, how I asked questions no one else thought to ask, how I corrected softly but expected precision. I paid attention to the girls, the ones who came in with straight spines and steady eyes, but carried centuries of doubt in the way they paused before speaking. I didn't push them. I simply created space. And over time, they filled it with more strength than they thought they had. I never gave an interview, never signed a book deal, never accepted the private offers that came in coded language from defense think tanks and national security advisors looking for consultants. I didn't post a title on LinkedIn. I didn't speak at conferences. I kept my head down and my mind sharp. Not because I was hiding, but because there is a kind of power that lives in restraint, the kind that doesn't need a spotlight to stay lit. Eventually, I got my own office. Small, windowless, just like everything in Division 9. But it was mine. On the far wall, I hung a single photo, one that no one asked about, and I never explained. It was a wide, grainy shot of a naval vessel cutting through water at dusk. No name on the hull, no flag flying, just motion, just presence. Below it, in small black font, was a single line. Some wars are fought in silence, and some victories don't need applause. I looked at that photo often, not out of nostalgia, but to remind myself that doing the right thing and being recognized for it are two entirely different pursuits. I had chosen the first. I had learned to live without needing the second. Years after I took that photo, a letter arrived at my off-grid mailing address. The handwriting was unmistakable. My father's. Inside there was no long apology, no dramatic confession, just 3 paragraphs written in that formal military-style script he used for every birthday card he'd ever given me as a child. He said he was proud, said he had been wrong, said he hoped someday I might understand the fear beneath his judgment, that he hadn't doubted me because he didn't believe in me, but because he didn't know what to do with a daughter who didn't ask for permission. I read the letter once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk. I didn't shred it. I didn't frame it. I didn't write back. closure isn't always about response. Sometimes it's just about letting the echo die in its own time. I live alone now, not out of bitterness or isolation, but because I learned early that stillness is where I'm strongest. I have friends the kind who understand that last-minute cancellations often mean something classified came up and they never ask for details. I take long walks early in the morning before the city wakes up. I drink black coffee. I still run, still test myself, still keep my muscles lean and my hands ready. You never fully leave Division 9, not mentally, not spiritually. The work has a way of shaping you from the inside out, and once you've learned to see in the dark, the daylight feels almost too bright. Sometimes I think about the girl I used to be, the one who sat at that kitchen table, trembling under her father's laugh. And I wish I could go back and whisper in her ear, "You were never fragile. You were just waiting for the right battlefield." But mostly I don't look back. There's too much still ahead. I train officers now who will carry missions I'll never read the results of. I prepare minds to think sideways, hearts to withstand pressure without turning cold. I teach them that intelligence work isn't about being clever. It's about being clear. About knowing what you're willing to protect, even when no one thanks you for it. And when they ask how long I've been doing this work, how I got here, what I had to give up, I just smile. Because that's the other thing you learn in this life. Not all truths need to be told out loud to matter. So I stay here, steady, watching, training, protecting peace not with parades but with precision. No headlines, no salutes. Just a single door with no nameplate and a room where quiet people do dangerous things for the sake of a world that will never know. And that's enough.